lecture titled Drug Control, Health and the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985, Considerations and Law. I'm really happy to welcome our guests, Senior Advocate Anand and Advocate Tripti. Anand, as many of you know, is a Senior Advocate at the Supreme Court of India. He's also been a Special Rapporteur, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the mental health. And more recently, he's also worked as a Special Public Prosecutor in the refugee case. He's also the Director of Lawyers Collective. Tripti is an advocate, and she's a Deputy Director of Lawyers Collective. It's an organization, it's a human rights organization based in Delhi and Bombay. And Tripti has been involved in a number of litigations and also advocacy initiatives around sex work, LGBT rights, and HIV, and also the NDPS Act more recently. I'm particularly happy to welcome Anand and Tripti also because they've been former colleagues. I started my professional life at the Lawyers Collective. So,
thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to be formal. I've been to Jindal twice before, and some of my ex-colleagues actually teach here. So it's always great to be here. The only thing I will say that there's no regular teaching job in Jindal that Mr. Rajkumar has offered me. Though I have sent him an invitation to offer, as you know, in contract law. Anyway, this is a different topic, not much talked about, but very, very important because it allows us to discuss issues which are of import not only in terms of society as a whole, social implications, but also in terms of the nitty-gritty of law, international conventions and human rights. Now, if you look at the drug issues in terms of law, traditionally drugs have been used, both opium, coca and cannabis, in different parts of the world, especially in Latin America and Asia, because in Asia you had both opium and ganja, cannabis and coca in Latin America. But in our part of the world, the regulations that came in were really governed by firstly the British and secondly the conventions that came about. But in the old days, the influence was not dictated by what you have today. So in fact, when you had the original British laws, the Opium Acts and the Excise Acts, they were basically to license and tax. There was no such thing as prohibition, which you are used to nowadays. It's all prohibition because of the perceived harm. In fact, very interestingly, in terms of the medical effects or the physiological or psychological effects, there was a commission which actually went into it. The British had set up a commission, the Indian Drugs Commission, in the previous century, the 19th century, and they actually came out with a report, which actually now we know is actually perfectly accurate. And it said that there is no evidence of any weight regarding the mental or moral injuries, that's the language that they use, from the moderate use of these drugs, including opium and ganja. Regular moderate use of ganja and bhang, it produces the same effects as a moderate regular use of, and the British would like to have whiskey, so it was whiskey. And opium is not deleterious in reasonable moderation, far less deleterious than alcohol. Now actually this has not been really controverted over the last 2 centuries in terms of, and now because we know what it is, Americans are legalizing it. But in the meantime, the devastation and the harm that the war on drugs has caused is very evident. And in terms of the old laws, you know that the opium trade was one of the major issues which actually allowed the British to continue the use and production, cultivation and promotion of opium. But it never, the colonial regime never actually prohibited it like we have done now. But in terms of, apart from the Indian Drugs and Commission, there was hardly any other scientific evaluation of it. Then you have the drug laws, or the drug conventions. And they are actually, historically, firstly the Shanghai Opium Commission, basically to set up, was set up to collect data and to find out how the trade was, because they were interested in trade. Remember, the British they colonized because they wanted trade. They used raw materials from India to produce them and then sell them back. Okay. Again, the Hague Convention then tried to regulate, prohibit production, manufacture, and distribution of drugs worldwide. And then you had the manufacturing agreement on internal trade and the use of opium in 1925. And basically, it actually moved, this is a move towards, gradually towards prohibition. So that's from legal use of it earlier, you move towards a prohibition. And then you have the original conventions in 1925, the Opium Convention, the Narcotics Convention in 1931, and then very importantly, incrementally, there are a few other conventions, but I don't want to get into too much of that. But the convention which is important for India is the Opium Limitation Protocol, which, as you know, India actually produces opium. And the regime today is that certain countries are allowed to produce drugs. They actually report to the International Narcotic Control Bureau, and the regime is such that you are given like quotas. You can produce this much. And so the countries have to report. So the origins of that are actually in the old convention or the protocol of 1953. Then you have the three main conventions. And these three main conventions, you will be familiar with, maybe you're not, but we just make a note of it. And this is the 61 Narcotics Drug Convention. These are the three prevalent conventions now. The 61 Narcotics Drug, the 71 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the Convention on Narcotic and Psychotropic Substances of 88. Now, the underlying thinking behind that is that these conventions or agreements, conventions are nothing but agreements, have been entered into because it is connected with health and welfare of mankind. This is very important. The underlying assumption is that. So, there is no such thing in the conventions as a war on drugs. This is the invention of basically the American presidents and their advisors. And I can tell you, the same sort of madness existed there in the regime of drugs as it exists in the present president of the United States or everything else. Okay? I hope you understood what I meant. So now the language is, what is the preambulatory objects and purposes? It says, the drug conventions, it recognizes, very importantly, the medical use of narcotic drugs continues to be indispensable. So, first thing is that the medical use is considered to be indispensable. For what? For relief, pain, suffering, adequate provision of that must be made, and to ensure the availability of those drugs. So now if you look at it, in terms of, just take an example, morphine is used for, do you know what morphine is? Morphine is used for pain. It's the most effective painkiller. My mother, who died 3 years ago in England, she had actually suffered a fracture and she was in acute pain, and she was administered dosages of morphine to numb the pain. Now, in England it's very easily available, and most developed countries it is available. But in India today, if you want to access morphine, it is not available except in Canada. But it's a very important drug. It is necessary for analgesic purposes, namely painkilling. But if you and I actually have a fracture and we want to use morphine in Delhi, we won't be able to access it. The law has changed thanks to Tripti's work. Tripti has actually been the advisor to change the law, and the law was changed. So there are essential narcotic drugs which have come in, and because of that, we will be able to access those drugs. But till now, the rules have not come in. So it's a huge process. We also say that as far as psychotropic substances are concerned, they are also indispensable. So basically, the medical use of these drugs is indispensable. So we have to weigh in terms of the right to health, whether those drugs are accessible or not, are they available? Availability in terms of international law is, if there are 10 people who require it, do all 10 get it? Accessibility is to do with affordability and geographical accessibility. So if we have a regime which actually prohibits and then does not serve the purpose of or the objects of the convention, you have to question it. So that's one very, very important point. Because of the laws which have been enacted in different countries, including India, the NDPS Act, pursuant to those conventions, the availability and accessibility of essential drugs has been increased. So this is one of the most important elements of the right to health, because essential medicines are very important in terms of availability of products for the right to health to be realized. Then, very importantly, the drug convention's objects and purposes recognize that addiction to narcotic drugs constitutes a serious evil. Now that's their philosophy. So there is one thing in recognizing that they are necessary for medical purposes, and the other thing is the philosophy which is underlying that these drugs are a serious evil. Now I want to see, I am a lawyer who is used to questioning everything. Okay? In fact, if you ask Tripti in my office, and Saptarshi will actually bear us out, if you come to my office, first of all, you don't call me sir. Secondly, if I put an idea on the table, you don't criticize it, you'll be asked to politely leave the next day. Because the idea is, as a lawyer, if you want your mind to be trained properly, you must question not only your own idea, but the ideas behind the law. So one question is, are they a serious evil? What do you say? If I take opium, is it a serious evil? What do you think? Why? Why not? See, nobody is saying yes or no. You have to reason it out. Somebody said no, you said?
Yeah, ultimately it's the usage by the person that will contribute negative attribute to a substance and not the substance.
Can you speak in simple English language? No, I know what to say, but I'm just trying to...
The substance itself isn't something that's after, but your usage or your method of utilizing that substance is something that is...
So would you agree that moderate use of, see, opium would be not very bad? That's what you're trying to say,
Yeah.
a practical level. How many people agree or disagree? Agree? 1, 2, 3, 4. Why do you agree? You can't just say yes. You must reason it out. And then we will deconstruct it and oppose it.
Okay, so what I'm doing to my body, if I'm not harming someone else.
No, that is not the question. We are not on the larger question of whether it is in public interest or in your individual interest. We are not on autonomy now. Is the substance harmful, objectively speaking, to somebody's physical, mental, psychological, physiological health? That's the issue.
If they're in moderation, no.
Okay, that's your surmise, or you're basing yourself on some research, or I would say myself also a bit of experience, but I won't be able to say for everyone. See, there was a person called Bill Clinton. Have you heard of him? He said he smoked, but he did not inhale. Okay, so I will not be in his company. But when I was a student like you, I did inhale and I did smoke it. So, but cannabis, not opium. You said, yeah, it's okay.
Sir,
Anand. We have to believe in equality as lawyers.
Anand, in Punjab, a lot of people have been, I mean, this is what I've read, that a lot of people have been addicted to heroin. And in order to, overcome that phase, what the pains that they undergo, the problems, they have been using opium to, sort of fight with it, and it has been useful for heart problems as well. So,
Sorry.
I also agree. Moderate use would require, if you, it's basically a chemical substance, and in your mind it gives you pleasure. So moderate use is essential for your well-being overall. Like when you receive a text on your phone that dopamine is released in your brain, that gives you certain kind of pleasure. So opium is also kind of a pleasure-giving substance, but in higher quantities it can be detrimental to your body, but in moderate usage.
Thank you very much. Anybody who disagrees? Sorry, because we have a limitation. So, please.
Yeah, where do you draw the line? So, saying that we consume it in moderation, would you determine what moderation is? Only who determines what moderation is. So, the moment you allow a substance which is undeniably harmful, no one can
Why do you say undeniably harmful?
Because even the argument which is being made was that if consumed in higher quantities, it is problematic.
Well, I'm a biochemist originally, and I can tell you, all biochemists will say even large consumption of water is harmful to you. Okay, I'm not joking. This is but anyway, no, but that's an important point. Let's discuss it. Now we have limitation of time. Who was here?
Same point actually, because if you talk about resistance, so over that point of time you will tell us what resistance, and according to that.
It's not an antibiotic.
Yeah, but even to drugs to an extent.
That's slightly even tolerance.
Tolerance, sorry, tolerance would be the better word. But and over the time you would develop a certain tolerance and you will start taking higher quantities. Now, how
Are you saying
determine-
this because of your own idea, or we have some basis for it?
Jason, I think it's more of a status that even with respect to heroin and other drugs that you tend to develop a certain tolerance.
Okay,
So
I want you to
determine.
flip the argument a bit. Is alcohol a drug?
Yes.
Does this apply to alcohol?
Yes, it does.
So why is it that alcohol, which actually, by the way, causes more deaths than any other drug?
I think it's more because even alcohol consumption is more than consumption of opium.
So why is it that opium, ganja, and coca were prohibited and not alcohol? You want to answer that?
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I think you've answered
Anand.
Anand, I think you pretty much answered that question already. I'll answer that by saying, firstly, a large amount of people die by heart attacks more than anything else. So by that metric analysis, you should remove McDonald's and Burger King from every place. That is not the answer in this case. I think the reason why alcohol and these things are still statutorily available and why drugs are seen as the war on drugs and political connotation to these sort of things. Hence, the accreditation that we give to drugs right now is the political virtue of these sort of things.
Is it political or is it something else? Anybody else? No women are active on this issue. Women must come up and say
So
something.
if I can put an idea on the table with regards to sort of expanding on what he just said, that a lot about why certain substance, why alcohol and tobacco are equally addictive as any other drugs are. But there is an accessibility provided to alcohol that is legalized and not for certain other drugs. And that is motivated by a lot of the market that is created on a worldwide, the markets that this economy funds, which would probably include terrorism, trafficking, all of those. So if you see it in the bigger picture, what do you think does those political, economical, keeping something, the more you keep something restrained means in the country the market price would go up. So that means more black money.
Just to quickly, stop on this, and we'll come back to it when we have discussion. Basically, it's got nothing to do with markets. It's originally the British wanted to promote it because of what you're saying, but later on it was the moral belief of Christians. Alcohol is perfectly okay, Last Supper, wine, but ganja, cannabis, coca, because it is the natives who drank it, it's not simple. So we don't have to go too far, and that's the rational basis of why it happened. Okay? But we'll discuss that later, so because we don't have too much time. But alcohol and smoking. In our office we have a lot of discussion. Tripti and I disagreeing on the issue of smoking. Just to let you know that we don't have to agree on every issue. But for example, alcohol is legally permissible for consumption, etc., everything. And there is no prohibition on it, except in certain states in India. As far as smoking is concerned, pursuant to the FCTC, Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, there is no prohibition on smoking, and smoking of tobacco, nicotine, is even more harmful than alcohol consumption. Alcohol consumption, large amounts will lead to cholesterol, etc. But I've been drinking since the age of 17. I don't have a cholesterol problem, because otherwise I keep fit, okay? But that depends on how you moderate your life, how do you run your life actually. So, very importantly, the drug conventions, object and purposes, then begin how to control illicit production by prohibition, and which according to the conventions pose a serious threat to health and welfare, without realizing that it is based on the moral precept which I talked about. So, one is the necessity to have these drugs for medicinal purposes, and the other, on the other side, balance was struck by the opposing aim of not allowing them to be produced because it should not be used for recreational purposes, where we differ with the objectives of the convention. Okay, so that's very important to understand. Now, importantly, the drug conventions do not talk about drug-free world. Do they talk about other things in terms of prohibition, etc.? That's the question. How is it from the drug conventions we have come to a situation where all over the world there is a prohibitionist policy which is the basis of law, where as a consequence of that, now our friend talked about Punjab. Most countries where the drug laws have been enforced, 50% of the people in jails are people who are there because of drug-related offences. Okay, and if you actually get caught in a drug-related offence, unless it's a very small quantity, it's beyond small quantity, intermediate or large quantities, you will not get bail and you will be there for 10 years. That's certain. And most of the people who are there are very poor, they can't even afford bail. And they can't afford access to justice. So we had a client who, a regular businessman, who was dealing with drugs in terms of supplying drugs legally. And he was unfortunately a victim of the drug laws, and he landed up in jail, couldn't get bail for 3 months, ultimately because the court realized, as the Punjab and Haryana High Court realized this was a legitimate dealer. They gave him bail, but he's still struggling, and he went to the High Court to quash it. And ultimately when the High Court realized that it's a case for quashing, and are still pending in the narcotics NDPS court for the matter to be quashed. But he told us that in his time in jail for 3 months in Punjab, most of the people who were there for drug-related offences could not access any lawyers. They were in there without any access to lawyers, and they would spend half the term, which is 5 years, and then they would get paid. But that's the norm. So this is the reality. Uttar Punjab and all that is just one part of it. The reality is there are huge numbers of people in Punjab, and that's going to happen to the rest of the country. Take it from me, who because of this law will be ending up in jail, their health will be affected, their families will be destroyed because of the misuse, if you want, or the use of law. Now, importantly, as I mentioned, the conventions do not talk about a drug-free world, but they have concerns about 3 issues. And this as lawyers you can try to play, because it's not going to be easy to change the NDPS Act in the next 10 years. Okay, there has been some change, and Tripti will talk about that, in terms of small quantities, addicts, etc. But addiction and actually dealing is very common, both overlap. So a person who is using it will also be dealing with it, and he or she or a transgender person may have more than a small quantity. So they will end up. But what is the concern of drug conventions is addiction. Okay? And what is the meaning of addiction? It's dependence. Basically dependence. Like if I take alcohol every day, which I do, thankfully, and one person mentioned that you need something for recreation. The other day we were in a meeting it was in Bangalore. Nothing to do with drugs. It was to do with tobacco, which is also another drug. So, I also do tobacco work, trying to work on the COTPA Act. And there is a difference of opinion between those who want to ban, though COTPA and the FCTC do not require prohibition. There are people who want prohibition. And the philosophy of FCTC and tobacco control is, no, you don't prohibit, you actually limit the areas of smoking, public areas, etc. But there also, there are people who said that everybody needs to relax for mental health, for emotional well-being. And one of the ways is to actually use drugs like alcohol or tobacco. So in terms of COTPA, it is not prohibited. In terms of alcohol, it is. But if I become dependent, what will happen? And I become so-called addicted, then if I don't get it, I will have physical and psychological and physiological problems, like tremors, etc. Now that is dependence, which is different. Okay? So it is the concern of the conventions, and therefore should be of the law. That's addiction. So if you want to do that, different policy may need to be adopted, and not just prohibition and putting people in jail. But is that being actually looked after? Similarly, it's abuse that they are concerned with. So the question is, what is the meaning of abuse? Legal technical term would be using it for another purpose than what that drug is meant for. But does recreational purposes amount to abuse? Question mark. I want you to think about it, because you can argue in terms of law that using a drug for medical purposes is legitimate, but for other purposes, embracing all the purposes, would it amount to misuse or abuse? Or would some be legitimate? So if you make a law, can you think of that? Now the other thing is, it's concerned, the conventions are concerned with illicit use. Now this is a tautology in the law, because you prohibit it and then you say illicit use. So it's a cycle which you can't get out of. So that's one area. But do the laws which are supposed to tackle addiction, pursuant to the conventions, and abuse really actually live up to that objective? That's the question mark as law. Okay. Then as far as the drugs are concerned, there are various classifications in terms of conventions, and they are based on the balance between the therapeutic use and the so-called abuse. In my opinion, if you think of abuse, you have to think about recreational use, whether that is abuse. In the old days, by the way, in the British days, if a person was actually using opium and was dependent or not dependent, they never really looked into that. They had what they call opium dens, or opium places where they could actually legitimately smoke. And even the law today allows all the doctors to prescribe and get that. Okay? The hangover of the old British laws. So that was the way. So if we are really concerned about addiction or dependence, should the law not be very different? But really, in terms of what is happening, is it the correct framework of law in terms of the convention is what we have to think about. Now, in terms of the schedules, there are a number of schedules, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the conventions, and We don't have schedules in that sense. We have the list of narcotic substances and psychotropic substances in our act. But the conventions have schedules, and they actually depend on whether it's harmful and whether it's therapeutically beneficial, and the balance between the two actually allows the classification to happen. But can we not use that here? We don't have that. We just have the schedule or the list in our IDPS Act, which is based on quantities. So that's another way of looking at the law, and in terms of how we actually see it in the context of the conventions. Now, one of the other issues is the conventions have their core obligations. The core obligations of the conventions are subject to the constitutional limitations that one has, or the constitutional mechanism that one has. So the conventions impose a mandate on countries and states to enact laws in accordance with their own constitutions. Okay? Now this is important because it also tells you that if you have a law, could you impose death penalty for that law? What do you think? Should you have death penalty for a law prohibiting drugs? Take an example. Yes or no? In terms of law.
Not
Why?
because I think it's punishment always has to be proportional. Now, the reason why we are actually prohibiting drugs and psychotropic substances is to an extent like because of the harm which is caused to other people also. But I don't really
Harm to other people meaning?
So if I am consuming myself, so it would be something. The way I think the NPS had to be that since I am taking some sort kind of drug, so my family is getting affected or I'm harming myself. Or in terms of if I'm selling it and other people are getting affected. So that's how I see it. So because the death penalty is not proportional to the harm which is perceived over here, assuming that aim is also special.
Any other points? Yeah, you didn't speak.
So the whole purpose of prohibiting these drugs is so that the person doesn't harm himself. And if you give death penalty to that, I mean you're killing the person and you're prohibiting him also. So it doesn't make sense.
But that's one way of looking at it. Anybody else?
Yeah, firstly, I think death penalty is only prescribed for smuggling or in the conventions also, or the laws. Correct me if I'm wrong, and not per se for use. But consider a country like Afghanistan or Iran, for example, a manufacturing, producing country and a transit country. They actually see it as a really big influence and a really big menace and problem for themselves. And their society also might see it. So probably we can say, okay, in India we don't need it. But if you go and ask Afghanistan, they might say it has fostered terrorism, it has fostered black market, so actually we need to deal with it. Sorry for you, your country might be safe and good, but not us. So in some circumstances it can be argued that it might be necessary because of smuggling and that illicit
But why, if you look at Afghanistan, we are a country which has legitimate quotas for cultivation, production. Why can't we have Afghanistan do it?
because it's just not stable. The political situation there is not stable, and there is a huge history behind it. Because it has been subject to the same countries actually promoting it to foster terrorism. It's based on evidence. Like US and UK actually promoted opium cultivation so that the war there or the terrorism could be fostered. So there is some indication. So I'm just saying it's not an opinion. It's just if you go outside your country, you might have different opinion where they say death penalty for smuggling, not usage.
We'll discuss death penalty in a minute, but I want to interrogate the point you're making about Afghanistan and cultivation of opium. If the government buys that opium, that the income that one gets will not be available to terrorists because you are trying to shut it down. The terrorists use that, but if it is legitimately bought by the government or the US, you actually serve a purpose. You actually cut the market away from the terrorists. And this has been suggested by a lot of authors, but not followed. But anyway, even if you are dealing at a very high level of international trafficking, do you think death penalty is warranted in those situations?
And it's not actually, it's not about my opinion.
I'm just
Yes,
asking.
it's not. I'm just trying to put another point across, and I wouldn't agree with the fact that Afghanistan can do it, because if Afghanistan had a stable government which had control over all of this, then it would be somewhere closer to a country like India, more stable. So it will also say then that yeah, death penalty is not mandatory. But right now, when it's not stable, and if you ask them that question, so it might be a different answer.
Okay, the other thing is that in our law earlier on, there was a section 32A. Okay? Huh? Yeah, 32A, not death penalty. We're talking about judicial review. That was not permitted. And the court in Dadu's case looked at it. And they said the conventions don't mandate it. So we will not allow a law which doesn't allow scrutiny by the courts. So what has happened is that when laws are being enacted by states, they go far beyond the mandate of the conventions. And in Dadu's case, the court had to restrain, in the sense, the legislative exercise of power of parliament and say, sorry, you can't prevent us as judges from looking at the law, and they actually are, the 32 is unconstitutional. So in our anxiety to be whiter than white people, as it were, when the convention doesn't prescribe anything, why do you go to that extent? So that's one thing that we have to look at. Now, the other area is, what about the drug conventions and how they actually match up to human rights obligations? Are there any human rights obligations which are important in terms of drug laws and drug convention? So, as we said earlier, death penalty is one of the areas where the Human Rights Convention comes in. Human Rights Convention, the ICCPR, clearly says it has to be the most serious crimes which would warrant such a thing. But it has to be eased out over a period of time. Ultimately, we must have no death penalty in the world in any state. But is, the trafficking in drugs such a serious thing that it warrants death penalty? That's the question. So one is the human right obligation of not to have death penalty. But in most laws, in Asia particularly, you have death penalty. What about the disproportionate? Somebody actually mentioned. Because proportionality is one of the inherent features of human rights obligations. What about proportionality? You have 10 years for possessing of commercial quantities or even more than small quantities. Is that proportionate? You don't get bail. Is that proportionate? These are issues which are important. How does a law match up to the human rights obligations? The other question that one has to look at is human rights obligation a must? Or are they just principles that we look at? Are human rights obligation in terms of the Civil and Political Rights Convention and the Economic and Social Rights Convention, are they obligations on a state? What do people think? In India, are they obligations which are mandatory, or they just principles or aspirations, like the directive principles? Sorry?
If you look at directive principles, are similar to the Economic and Social Convention that is called it. But obviously, like Supreme Court has said that few of the fundamental rights are, some of the economic and social rights are fundamental rights, and the state has it by them. But I think more or less, in India, we generally perceive them to be very based on discretion of the state. This is something like right to shelter, right to cultural rights, they need to be very mild in nature.
So you would argue that civil and political rights are obligations which are mandatory?
I would, and even this special rapporteur, and even he said that there's this inherent there's this wrong belief that economic and social rights are inferior to political rights. So I would think that freedom of speech is actually equal and equally important to other rights such as shelter or food or cultural rights.
Anybody else want to say anything? Yes.
But states in case of human rights treaties are competent to make certain delegations and interpretive declarations if they don't agree to follow all provisions of that treaty. So in that sense, states are free to, they're sovereign to sort of impose their own law, their own domestic understanding by derogating from certain provisions of human rights treaties. So I would think that they are in the nature of principles of human rights.
They are?
In the nature of principles and not always
They
mandatory.
are not obligations.
Yeah.
Okay, one is the difference between civil and political rights and the other is economic and social rights. I have written about that. And I said there is an artificial distinction which is not sustained by legal principles between the two of them. The other is the derogation by reservation. But states do that. For example, in CEDAW they have done it. India has done it. But on ICCPR and ICSCR, India has not derogated by reservation. So their obligations, actually their obligations, how you perform those obligations is a different matter. But the other thing is, are they enforceable rights in law? So they are enforceable now because if you sign up to the optional protocol, then if there's a decision, and both have optional protocols, then if there's a decision of the committee which is the relevant committee, okay, it becomes enforceable like that. So now it is no longer possible to argue that either of these rights in those conventions are not mandatory obligations. But how they are articulated in your constitution would differ. So for example, in a civil law country, they, once they sign and ratify, they become applicable law, enforceable at law in a court of law in say Latin America. In India, because we are common law countries, what happens is that we have to domesticate the law. Unless you take the Vishaka route, which is an unusual route. But even in the Vishaka route, it allows a court to enforce a treaty obligation even though there is no domestic law. So they are mandatory obligations. How they are articulated, how they are perceived by the court, and how they are actually seen as enforceable is different. So we have taken the route of these being read as part of fundamental rights. I don't know if you remember, in the old days, the fundamental rights were read with directive principles. And then international human rights obligations are also part of the fundamental rights. So fundamental rights have to be read with that. So the question is, how do you see these? Are the human rights obligations not being derogated from when you have these laws? So one of the issues is mandatory death penalty. Mandatory death penalty was beaten out in India until we challenged it and it's become discretionary. The other is the disproportionate nature of the sentences that are imposed. Thirdly, and very importantly for health purposes, because of the prohibitions nature of the law, there is no access to medicines, as we talked about palliative care. And that is a human right obligation, right to access medicine. Then, people who are actually drug users, they are put into prisons. As I mentioned, large number are in prisons. And if they are dependent on it, is there any access to those substitution therapies? Again, you are violating a human right obligation. And sometimes, not in this country so much, but maybe in private setups, which are treatment centers, there is coercive treatment. And coercive treatment has been held and explained by special rapporteurs to be in violation of human rights obligation also. So, how do you match up in terms of human rights obligation? One has to see. Now, in terms of compliance, there's a huge issue in compliance of human rights obligation and the drug conventions. What about the issue which comes up, the principle of sovereignty and non-compliance? That one issue is very, very important. Do the states have mechanisms to enforce the human rights obligation? Another issue. Now, a third issue is, for example, right to life has been used by a lot of countries to embrace the right to health. What is the understanding of right to health? This is a big issue. So when you as lawyers look at this and the human rights obligations, the right to life in India includes the right to privacy under 21, the right to dignity, the right to health. There are three facets which have been involved. Now of course the Attorney General now has said that there is no right to privacy in India. You don't have a right to your own bodily integrity. Whether that's a correct proposition or not is an open issue. What about redressal mechanisms? A human right obligation includes redressal mechanisms, grievance redressal mechanisms. So if the state violates human rights, what is the redressal mechanism within the country? Then, drug control and obligation in the convention. Is it a human right obligation to prevent people from being incarcerated, being treated? What is the precise nature of this obligation? We have to think about that. Now, very importantly, if we start thinking about these issues, can we come up with any alternatives? Suppose we were to think, we want to make sure, and it's a legitimate aim to say that people should not be dependent on drugs, right? People should not be addicted. So you should make drugs available, say like alcohol, but they should not become dependent. Can you think of that sort of scenario at all? Yes. So if you start thinking of that, you are very pessimistic.
Yeah. I think if people find it enjoyable, they are made to exploit it. If I find alcohol very soothing and if I have so much economic hardship, I'm bound to drink, right?
So obviously you don't find cannabis soothing.
I don't know, but then I'm not like that.
Natural drinking is not much easier.
So,
I can tell you it's very great fun. I can tell you from experience, I will not lie. So, if you start thinking of, no, the only policy that actually is the basis of the law today is prohibitionist. So, can you think of an alternative policy which will meet those ends and objectives? The objectives are that we want to make sure that people are not dependent on drugs. Okay? They do not become addicted. Their health doesn't suffer. Because the laws and conventions are to make sure that health and welfare of mankind, humankind, is actually further. If that is the case, and you need these medicines and drugs for medical purposes, how do you achieve this objective if it is not prohibition?
Sir, there is a TED talk about this. It's a case study about a European country, maybe Netherlands, in which it was reported that it had a very high drug users, percentage of very high drug users. So what the government did was it legalized every drug in that country, and the percentage of drug users and it focused on rehabilitation of the drug users. And so what happened was the percentage of drug users actually dropped in that country.
Well, I don't think you're actually right, but I know what you're trying to say. It happened in Portugal. Okay, so minimal use. But they did not legalize all drugs. But some of the drug consumption, they did not use the prohibitionist incarceration method. And they found that because a lot of times they say that criminal actions are associated with drug use. If I actually use drugs, then I'm likely to commit another offense. So that did not happen when they legalized some of those drugs. Okay? Now, one of the things is to legalize some of the drugs. So that is happening in Europe. That is happening in the US, which was the pinnacle of the war on drugs. So what do you think of that? Should we legalize any particular drugs if that's an option? Is it an option? Sorry?
I have a question. You mentioned earlier that you would argue this case
Of?
the case of whether like you not planning to keep tobacco act rather than going for prohibition sort of thing. It rather forces you or it encapsulates certain areas where you can go ahead and so by the same argument, by the same logic, if we divorce the idea of moralistic whatever overtures on this, if you made the argument that let's have prohibition but let's skyrocket the price, make sure that only legalized people can take it and have like a special niche for people who have medical use for it. So you take care of poor people because prices are too high. You take care of people who
So they won't be able to recreate at all.
Yeah, so if you have recreation, then let's make it so that only the richest of the rich can then.
Poor people can't recreate.
Yeah, so you're saying if
No, I'll give you a lot of the poor people, and you can ask people from Punjab, they cannot afford alcohol, but they can afford a bit of ganja in their night. So the rickshaw drivers who are driving, the cycling after the hard day in the hot weather.
I would
like
argue
in
that
India.
enough coffee rather than having a ganja. Like
Coffee doesn't kill you, pain. Ganja does.
Chemically also the purpose is entirely different.
He is not in favor of using drugs for recreation. Because it doesn't give you anything. Coffee, if you drink a lot of coffee, you'll have a stomach crunch. It will keep you awake.
it
Yeah.
affects your body, being a lot of calories.
No, but so this is one way. Basically legalize it, but don't allow the poor to. Rich people can enjoy that. What do you want to say? Excuse me.
This is not equality, that is discrimination on the basis of how much you earn and how much you think recreation is meant for what section of the society. That wouldn't be an idealized form of purpose that we are about to pursue, but rather than that, it would be better that if we are talking in terms of medicinal purposes, something like that, the government should have this very clear thought in their mind on the state or whatever what it is talking about, that things that are useful to other people get paid or to supplement other diseases that are being developed, or other ways some psychological diseases have been tend to have a proper effect by using some other drugs of that sort. You should either get into an environment of how it is supposed to work and retaliate, or not retaliate, plus take it and account and see how it goes, rather than keeping it only for recreation purposes and not for medicinal purposes. This creates a far.
No, you would obviously have it for medical purposes,
Yes.
but should you also have it for recreational
Of course
purposes
you should, because
and not criminalize that?
you shouldn't, because other than us sitting right here, there are people who are working hard every day, and the only part of their life that they do enjoy is sitting with other people who work in the same at the same amount. That is recreation. Coming from a place where I've seen people do it, I think everybody should enjoy a moment in their life which is recreation, and that's one need, one psychological need of everybody. So I'm up for recreation for everything.
Anybody else? So, yeah, sorry.
So, generally speaking, in terms of any drug, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or narcotics and psychotropic substances, some narcotics and psychotropic substances, I generally believe that prohibition as a policy does not work.
Why?
Because prohibition does not work because one of the main reasons is because it creates a huge black market, and that skyrockets or that turns into, it starts a whole vicious cycle of other problems coming to the fore. The black market where the money is going, how who is supplying, how it's being sourced, all of that. So that creates more problems than solutions. So on the other hand, what I believe is that strict regulated removal of a ban, but strict regulation with a strong focus on harm reduction. And harm reduction, at least if we're not there, where we can't at least go towards legalization, a stronger focus on harm reduction is, I think, a genuine need.
But if you have legalization of some drugs and maybe part of that, like using it, consuming it, and not trafficking in it, but then you would actually legalize it partly.
Of course, then trafficking wouldn't be a question if it's legalized, right? Because
Okay,
you
anybody
would
else?
give,
Nobody disagrees with that.
avenues.
Certainly, it should be allowed. Like even for in the case of alcohol, more than the 50% of the revenue of the state come from alcohol, from the excise, which is, and moreover, it should some drugs should certainly be allowed, and the focus should be on the rehabilitation in case of dependence, people who get dependent on it. Like the focus should be on the rehabilitation part and
For the dependent.
for the dependent people, and prohibition in every case, like the black market, leads to like it is not good, it is accepted.
I think it should be allowed for recreation also, whatever is legalized, because the difference, it comes from inherent assumption which we are all brought up in a society. We see alcohol as something which is okay for both rich and poor, for consumption, but we do not see ganja or other drugs as okay for poor or rich. We bring that class, and we have that inherent assumption in our minds that there is something wrong with ganja. Whereas if recreation wise, if you see, if you allow it and people tend to use it in controlled, like there would be controlled use of it. There's alcohol abuse also in certain cases. When you
According to women's groups, alcohol abuse is rampant. So men go and drink and then they resort to domestic violence against their wives and partners, and they use all the money they earn. What about that?
But with the effects of cannabis is quite different than alcohol. So I'm pretty sure, like, even if there's like a person uses cannabis too much, they won't get violent. So that domestic problem would go away with overuse of cannabis.
So why do you think that people overuse alcohol?
Because they try to escape from reality, I believe, it's kind of a...
But this, even rich people do. I know people, their reality is quite good in terms of so many good things. But why do they do excessive drinking? So that's the problem in alcohol. I have been drinking since the age of 17. I've never got drunk. Would you believe it? And I still enjoy it's not whiskey. I have an old mug, which is the cheapest, best drink ever in India. So, yes. Do you have a prescription for excessive drinking? No.
Many people agree that marijuana should be legalized or for recreational medicine purposes. But there is a premise that it should be strictly controlled by the government. So I asked that why should it even be controlled by the government? Why shouldn't we allowed to grow our own marijuana? I mean, it is a plant, and why should the government use this to make profit from us?
No, that now you're getting into the realm of capitalism and profit making. And in fact, in the US, it's become one of the largest businesses in California and other places where you legally grow marijuana. It's become one of the biggest businesses. And they have boutique marijuana, particular types, like we have boutique teas, they have boutique marijuana. So anyway, what I want to end up with is, there are different methods of trying to regulate and control, pursuant to the conventions. One is the way that the US, some of the countries in Europe are going, some of the countries in Latin America are going, and the other one is Philippines. I hope you know what is happening in Philippines, where the president is actually making sure that drug users are being killed. That's one way, which is, according to me, is very much part of the convention. At least even if it is not part of the convention legally, you know, speak in the convention, which is war on drugs. Leave people to do these things. You actually stigmatize people so badly that it's considered to be perfectly legitimate to kill people. I don't want to get into another topic, but the way things are going on in this country, where you actually stigmatize people who eat beef and therefore go and start attacking people or not even carrying cows, means that you can take the law into your own hands. That is disastrous for any democratic country which believes in the rule of law. The moment you go on to that road, it's a slippery slope. And that's what the president in Philippines has actually done. It's a culmination of what happens before. If you allow people to take the law into your own hands, then it's very difficult to stop people. As lawyers, as people will become lawyers, judges or whatever, it's very important for us to see that the rule of law is preserved and have laws which actually facilitate the objective and be critical of that. So with that, either questions or we can go on to this. You want to do that? Whatever you want.
What I was asking is that in certain conventions when you have, so every country has different internal laws. And sometimes the conventions are not with mandatory internal laws, you can actually resort to it. Now the state now has reserve themselves to it. One such example is Bahrain, then it reserved itself from ICCPR. So in that case, how would you tackle issues of these policies where a country would actually reserve itself to either provide hosts, like direct type of fair trial, or death penalty, or execution? How would you tackle it?
No, you see, it depends on treaties. There are different types of treaties in international law. One is the type of treaty which is the human rights treaties. Okay, those human rights treaties have their own enforcement mechanism. So whereas the ICCPR is concerned, or the ICSCR is concerned, there the mechanism is reporting to the various committees. Okay, one. And if you are a party to the international protocol, then you will actually be subject to those adjudications. Okay, that's one. The second type of treaty is like the WTO treaties. Those treaties have internal mechanism of dispute resolution. So, for example, in the TRIPS agreement, if you are not following the mandate of TRIPS, which has flexibility, as the drug conventions also have, okay, we shall come to that. If you don't follow, then you can be taken to the dispute panel, and we, in our case, when the TRIPS agreement was actually signed on in 1995, we were supposed to have an interim regime till 2005, when the patent law actually kicked in compliance with the TRIPS agreement. And we were supposed to have exclusive marketing rights as opposed to patents. And we didn't bring that in, okay? Because though the government actually put the bill in Parliament, parliamentarians refused to pass the bill, okay? So we were taken to the dispute panel, we lost. We were taken to the appellate, we went to the appellate dispute panel, we lost. And then we had to introduce it. If we did not, sanctions would be imposed on us. So there are different types of treaties where the mechanisms are different. So here it doesn't work like that. In terms of death penalty, it is the ICCPR. And there's a phasing out. There is no mechanism unless you're in the optional protocol. You argue as a litigant, then it may be held that death penalty is in violation of Article 6. But that's the mandate of ICCPR. That only the most serious offences can you have it, and over a period you have to phase it out.
We agree that prohibition is bad and drugs in principle should be legalized. The next question which comes is which drug should be legalized and how legalized the drug should be. So, do you have any comments on this? Because we cannot just blanketly legalize each and every drug and make it available to each and every member of the society. We need to have some regulations, like below 18 people should not be able to use drugs. People who are driving should not be able to use drugs, because there are concerns which we need to take in mind before actually legalizing drugs.
Well, first of all, I think the issue of legalizing certain drugs, not getting into which ones, is a very important issue for us to propagate an idea. It's a big uphill task to convince people of that. Let's be very honest. And I think the situation is ripe in this country where we are facing an acute crisis in a state like Punjab, which is going to be very, very bad. We know what's happening and they have no solutions. They're just enforcing a bad law and it's going to create more problems. At this juncture, it's very important to posit that this is not the way and there are better mechanisms which countries have experimented with, like Portugal legalizing certain drugs, and there is no deleterious consequence following that. That's one. So, and again, it's better to follow a set example, a trodden path, rather than inventing your own idea. So, even on the question of which ones, obviously, is more acceptable that we would legalize in ganja. Ganja technically is not illegal. Bhang. So, bhang is anyway not illegal. So, next thing is ganja. So, you can think like that. Cannabis or marijuana or whatever. So, you can have soft drugs, which are more amenable to legalization than heroin or opium. Though I don't see the reason why it is. It is purely recreational and you can limit it, like in the smoking situation. If I am doing it personally and I'm not going to be driving. I'm not doing an act which will actually have a harm on the public or any other person, then there is no question. That includes, I don't know whether you're having sex after marijuana, which is very pleasurable, I must tell you. But I don't know whether that would be included, because obviously you should not cause harm to another person. If I'm smoking in my own room, that can't be prohibited. So, but when you are driving, when you're doing other things, obviously it's a no-go area. So, I don't think we can start thinking of that right now. The first thing is to bring home to the people in India that this is a wrong law. Because right now we are on the mode, more the punishment the better. Whichever law it is. You know, something is not working, okay, give not 10 years, give 30 years. Then life sentence has become the full life, even in courts. So the mode of thinking today is that the more punishment you give, the better it is. Or even have death penalty. More and more death penalty now, in more laws. Is it working? It can't work because people don't behave on the basis of what is going to be meted out to you at the end of a trial. So I think there's a huge debate to be engaged on these issues first before we go into the type of prescription of which drugs should be legalized or not. But I think the answers should be based on a part which is already trained by other countries, because we have good examples and experience. So US, Portugal, etc. and other Latin American countries. But the debate is very important. And you will be the people who will be the future leaders in the legal field, so you will have to engage in the debate. We'll be past it. At least I will be. I don't know about Tripti. Unless it happens in the next 20 years.
Marijuana is going to be happening.
I hope so, because it is one area where Indians have never had a problem. By the way, I must tell you, and I think you know this, in terms of Hafim, opium, when this law came in, I think at that time or sometime later, Jaswant Singh, much later, he was the minister, foreign minister of a first NDA government. And he said, I mean, because there was a lot of opposition to these controls, that in Rajasthan, and this is true even now, that if you go to somebody's house, you don't get a cup of tea, you get a choti budi goli of Hafim. And people are not addicted to it. Like in France, people drink wine every day. But how do they drink it? They drink it with their dinner. Okay? They don't drink 10 glasses of it. Some do. There will be some people who are not. Everybody is not the same. Thank God. So there will be some people who will drink excessively. That will be because of religion. You know. But in India, culturally, and in terms of societal mores, people were actually giving, when people came home in Rajasthan, Hafim. So it's not alien to us. So I don't think there will be that type of a problem if we were to legalize. But I think the climate is very difficult now. Not easy to do.
States are shifting to a prohibitionist model. Bihar banned
alcohol,
but they were they are going to do it in phases.
Yes. I think they're realizing the follow of it already, because there's so many problems associated with it. Any other questions? Otherwise, Tripti will make our. I went on to